Chapter 8 of the Sheridan Road Mystery. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. The Sheridan Road Mystery by Paul and Mabel Thorne. Chapter 8. A Definite Clue. "You can take your hand off that gun now," suggested Marsh, as he smiled at Morgan and went back to his chair. "I'll tell you my part of the story, and perhaps we'll find in the end that two heads are better than one. You have made a big, but perhaps a natural mistake. If you doubt my word in anything I am about to tell you, it will only be necessary for you to consult the Secret Service branch in the Federal Building to confirm my status in this case. Without any intention of trying to kid you, Morgan, I want to say this. You've done some quick and clever work in approximately 24 hours. I realized from the first that things had framed themselves in a peculiar way against me. Yet I will say frankly that I did not expect a local policeman to put the facts together so quickly." "I am only human, Marsh," broke in Morgan, "and your appreciation sounds good to me. But let's get down to the story." "Quite right," agreed Marsh. "It begins 2 years ago. At that time the government discovered that counterfeit $5 bills were appearing in the East. They put me on the case, and I traced them from city to city. Suddenly the output seemed to stop. For a time I was at loose ends, and then I had word that they were appearing again in St. Louis. I made a quick jump to that city. Counterfeit $5 bills are comparatively easy to pass. A larger bill may attract attention, but $5 is a commonly used unit. For that reason, few people could remember and describe the person who had tendered the bill. But to make a long story short, I finally brought their source close to a man named Atwood, by finding out that his daughter Jane occasionally paid for things with this particular series of counterfeit $5 notes. I located this man's home, where he lived with his wife and daughter. Neighbors believed him to be a traveling man, as he was away a great deal. I never got a look at the man, because in some way he evidently got wind that we were watching him, and stayed away from the house. From neighbors, however, I learned that he was tall, well-built, dark-haired, and wore a small mustache. Not exactly a definite description, but one which might help in connection with other things. Finally, I got a new clue from Detroit, which seemed to indicate that I would find the man there. It came to nothing, however, and when I returned to St. Louis, I found that Atwood's wife had died in the meantime, that he had stored his furniture, and his daughter was living in a hotel. I figured that there was nothing to do but keep a close watch on her from that time on, and eventually get in touch with Atwood, then through him locate the other members of the gang. While there was no direct evidence that such was the case, we know from experience that in a counterfeiting case there are almost always 2 or more persons engaged in the work. One night this girl gave me the slip, and it took me nearly 2 weeks to trace her to Chicago. Keeping watch on places where these bills occasionally appeared, I recognized her one day, and then located her in this apartment building. Now, experience had shown that this case was really a game of patience. So far, little had been accomplished by hanging around the streets and watching the girl. A vacant apartment in this very building gave me an unusual opportunity. You know, Morgan, there are few crimes that the government looks on with such severity as counterfeiting. To apprehend a counterfeiter, they will go to any lengths and spend any amount of money. So I received permission to rent this apartment. It gave me the advantage of not only being right in the building constantly, without attracting special attention, but as I was on the floor below the suspects, I had an excellent opportunity to keep an eye on all who passed up and down the stairs. Another fortunate circumstance was the fact that the apartment above me was unoccupied. There could be no question as to where people passing up and down the stairs were going. Government men, as you know, Morgan, usually work with the utmost secrecy. Our own local men were not even supposed to know I was here, unless the time came when I should need help. It was not logical, therefore, for me to disclose my identity or give any hint of it to the real estate firm that rented me the apartment. That was why I posed as a ranch owner from Mexico, here in Chicago, for the purpose of interesting certain financial interests in my property. That left out the entangling subject of references. Naturally, I did not want to waste money on the complete furnishing of an apartment, which might be vacated at any moment, so I simply furnished up that part of it which might come under the eye of a stranger, and certainly these 2 rooms afforded me all the comfort that I required. "But, Marsh," interrupted Morgan, "why did you make those breaks about your wife, and knowing Ames upstairs?" "A man in your line of work, Morgan, ought to understand the wife idea, now that you know some of the facts. A supposedly married man passes quite unnoticed, but just give the ladies a hint that a bachelor is in the house, and immediately everyone focuses attention upon him. He is a poor, lonesome man, to be pitied, and every woman in the house would have lain awake nights figuring how she could introduce me to a marriageable young woman. So I invented Mrs. Marsh as a protection. I'll admit that my claim of friendship with Ames didn't work out well in this instance. However, it was an idea conceived in a hurry, and in the ordinary course of events would have really attracted little, if any, attention. You realize that I was in this house to watch certain people without disclosing my identity in any way. I knew positively that the flat over me was closed and empty. Then I was awakened suddenly in the night by a most suspicious disturbance. Naturally, I connected it immediately with the people I was watching. If I took an active interest in this trouble, it might force my hand, because a moment's consideration will show you that the connection was only a guess on my part, and might not be a fact. My first thought, therefore, was to get the local police on the job as quickly as possible, and still keep in touch with the incident myself. You may ask why I didn't telephone the police department, instead of running into the street. When I looked at my watch, I saw that it was 2 o'clock, and I knew from observation that a patrolman was likely to be within a block or two of the house at that hour. On the other hand, if I telephoned, it might be 20 minutes before your men arrived. And you know, Morgan, that a lot can happen in 20 minutes. After your man had telephoned for help, he was disinclined to have me butt into the matter any further. Yet you can see how imperative it was for me to be on the job, as well as your men. The first thought, and the most logical excuse which came to my mind, was to tell the patrolman that the tenant of the flat was a personal friend of mine. This made it seem perfectly natural for me to follow up his interest in the matter. As to keeping track of your movements, it was only natural that I would want to keep in touch with your progress in the case as much as possible. "One question, Marsh," said Morgan. "How in thunder could you see my partner's footsteps as you said you did in your apartment?" Marsh laughed. "Through a simple precaution that I have taken ever since I moved in here, a little talcum powder sprinkled over the dining-room floor. Now, Morgan, I have laid my cards on the table. You can see the close connection that probably exists between the Atwood counterfeiting case and whatever took place in the flat over us. If you have found out anything, outside of what you suppose to be my connection with the case, I would like to have the information. So that you can see how close the connection between the two cases really is, I will tell you that after your men left Tuesday morning, I did a little further investigating on my own account, and found what I believe to be a definite clue to the Atwoods' connection with the trouble." "What was that?" asked Morgan. "A small smear of blood on the doorknob of the Atwood apartment." The fact that Marsh, who had been surrounded by such suspicious circumstances that Morgan had been enabled to build up one of his quickest cases, had now turned out to be an operative of the federal government, was one of the most astounding things with which Morgan had ever met. It was obvious that for once in his life he had followed persistently on a blind trail, and now found himself only a little better off than when he started. Naturally, his professional pride was hurt, but the candid way in which Marsh had, to use his own words, laid his cards on the table, appealed to Morgan. He felt that this government man was both broad-minded and efficient. He realized that there was surely more to gain by accepting Marsh's proposition and working with him than there would be if each worked alone, and very probably at cross purposes. The story which Marsh had told him, the surprising clue he had just offered, and the facts in his own possession showed conclusively the close connection between the affair of the empty apartment and the Atwood counterfeiting case. Locating the murderer would undoubtedly bring the counterfeiters to light, and in the same way locating the counterfeiters would probably disclose the perpetrator of this now unquestioned crime. Morgan covered up these deliberations by getting out his pipe and tobacco pouch and lighting up. "Now I can talk," he said, as he leaned back in his chair. "I may have a few facts that you don't know, Marsh, and now that I know the whole situation, I can see that they will probably be of some value to you, or in any event of value to both of us in the general working out of the case. For I want to say that I am satisfied with your suggestion about our working together. I called on this Miss Atwood yesterday. While some of the information which she gave me simply ties up with and confirms your own story, there was one thing I discovered that may help us. Of course, in lining up my evidence, I separated the strong points against you from certain suspicious circumstances connected with the Atwoods. That girl impressed me so favorably that I could not definitely connect her with the trouble upstairs. Instead, I was inclined to believe that I had uncovered something else. During my talk with the girl, I noticed a peculiar mark on her arm. I brought the conversation around to that mark, and she told me that some time during the night of the crime she had been awakened by a sharp sting in the arm, but had almost immediately gone to sleep again. Noticing the mark in the morning, she was under the impression, so she said, that it was a bite from some kind of insect. I suggested a spider, but the truth was, Marsh, that mark was made by a hypodermic needle. In my experience, I have come into contact with lots of dope users. I know just how they act, talk, and look, And that girl is not a dope fiend. In my opinion, there are only two solutions to that mark on the girl's arm. Either she had not slept well of late and decided to use something to help her, or else somebody jabbed her without her knowledge. The first explanation is hardly likely, because sleeplessness is treated in other ways. Now that you tell me that this man Atwood is a criminal, and that you found a bloodstain on the doorknob, I am convinced that someone gave her an injection of morphine so that this job could be pulled without her knowledge. You probably know as well as I do that the small purple mark, accompanied by the swelling, which I noticed on her arm, would result only from the hasty and careless use of a hypodermic needle. "What you tell me, Morgan," said Marsh, "confirms what I have thought for some time. That is, that Jane Atwood is only the innocent tool of her father and the gang behind him. Perhaps not even that. She exhibits none of the instincts or earmarks of the criminal woman, and no woman with easy money at her command would spend the hours and hard work which she does in the study of music. Confidentially, Morgan, I like the girl, and what I have just told you is one of the reasons why I have never attempted to arrest her and force a confession. I felt that all I could really do was to keep her under surveillance until such time as I could catch one of the real criminals getting in touch with her. The father and his gang have either simply been using her to a limited extent to pass their counterfeit notes, or else he has included a few with money which he gave her. Possibly he has maintained her in a home to have a background of respectability to which he could retire in emergencies. Letting her use counterfeit notes may have been just one of the slips of which every criminal is guilty. A really clever man is also clever enough to know that it doesn't pay to be a criminal. No matter how long the rope, there is always an end to it. "Well," said Morgan, "there is no question that as matters now stand, that girl is our only working point. I have already called on her, and disclosed my identity as a detective, so as far as I am concerned, there is little that can be done in that direction. You, as a tenant in this house, however, could cultivate her acquaintance without arousing any real suspicions on her part." "I have been watching for an opportunity to strike up an acquaintance for a long time," replied Marsh, "but no such opportunity has yet presented itself. You can rest assured, however, that I am ready when it does." Just then Marsh sat up and listened, as footsteps sounded over their heads. "That's all right, Marsh," smiled Morgan. "Those are my men taking fingerprint photographs. That was the next point I was going to tell you about, my discoveries in that apartment." "You found fingerprints?" cried Marsh. "No, just the marks of the sides of two hands, apparently not of much use, but then you can never tell." Morgan suddenly jumped to his feet. "Good Lord!" he exclaimed. "That reminds me. I forgot that I had a man sitting outside on the stairs. He'll be wondering what has happened." With that, Morgan went to the door and told the plain-clothes man, who had been waiting outside, that everything was going smoothly and he could go back to the station. Returning to his chair, Morgan took up the subject of the clues he had discovered in the apartment. After recounting his discovery of the cuff button, he added, "And that was one of the most damning pieces of evidence which I had against you, Marsh, the letter M on that cuff button." "That would not have gone very far," laughed Marsh, "because I've never worn an initialed cuff button in my life. In fact, Morgan, it could have been only a clue, not evidence, for it would have been simple, when the loss was discovered, to also lose the duplicate. That cuff button may or may not be a clue. Of course, the tenant's initials do not coincide with the initial on that button, but it might have been dropped by a servant or a friend. As a matter of fact, that button might have been lying under the cabinet for some time before Ames went to Europe. However, it's something worth having and remembering, for one never can tell when even a little thing like that may give some lead that will prove worthwhile." "How would you analyze that flattened bullet?" asked Morgan. "The shot was fired at close range," Marsh replied. "It may have passed clear through the person fired at. That bullet is worth remembering, however, just like the cuff button. Some day it may fit in with and explain other evidence." "There is one more point," added Morgan, "that may or may not have a bearing on this case. Last night, while my partner Tierney and myself were conferring on this case at my house, somebody tried to listen outside my door. I was pretty sure this was so from the sounds I heard, and when I went to the door, somebody dashed down the stairs and escaped in a motor car. I'm ashamed to say it now, but at the time I suspected it was one of your confederates." "You've been mixed up in a good many cases, Morgan, and probably have some half-finished affairs in the back of your head right now. I would say that such an occurrence could be connected with any one of these. On the other hand, this case is very fresh, and you have been active in working it up. Some person may be trying to find out just how close you are to getting to the trail, so as to take precautions if necessary." At that moment there was a scream in the hall outside Marsh's door. Both men sprang to their feet, and Marsh leaped to the door. Chapter 9.